The sources of the earliest Chinese Buddhist images were the kingdoms of Central Asia that in turn were in contact with the Buddhist kingdoms in Gandhara, which is in present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. In this area, Alexander the Great had established his most eastern kingdoms and introduced provincial forms of classical architecture and sculpture. From these areas, under Western classical influence, the Chinese took iconographic forms and sculptural types, absorbing, at the same time, other Indian sculptural styles. In Gandhara, the Buddha was portrayed in his human form, not symbolically as had been the custom earlier in the Indian subcontinent. This image is a typical example. The Buddha stands dressed in a loose robe which clings closely to his body. The cloth between his legs fall in concentric U-shaped folds, reminiscent of the robes seen on sculptures in the classical West. This model was adapted by the Chinese for their earliest images of the Buddha, and the first Chinese bronze figures display U-shaped folds. Early Chinese images of bodhisattvas, with their bare torsos and arrays of jewels, were equally dependent on foreign examples. For example, this gilt bronze figure of the bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, known as Guanyin in China, is from the Northern Wei dynasty and is dated to 471 of the Common Era. This small image retains the strong rounded forms that the Chinese adopted from the lands to the west. The most extensive surviving early Chinese Buddhist remains are large cave temple sites, stretching from the eastern end of the Silk Route at Dunhuang into the heart of China. In many places, caves were hollowed out of the cliff face and decorated with images and figure scenes. Some of the most impressive early Buddhist images from China can be found in the cave complex of Yungang, which was constructed near the capital of the Northern Wei dynasty at Datong in Shanxi province. This Buddha is from Cave 20 and is dated to the early 5th century of the Common Era. He is seated with his hands in the meditation gesture. At the Yungang complex, there are 5 massive Buddha figures that show some similarity with the Buddha images found to the west. The heavy solidity of the forms illustrate the Chinese attempt to create monumental sculptures of the type that they had heard described. The shoulders and torso of the figure in Cave 20 are bulky and angular, while the robe is shown as delicate and thin by comparison, lying in neat, sharp folds which mimic the folds of the robes on figures from Gandhara. Later, in the 6th century, cave temples were constructed at Longmen and Gongtian, where the heavy figure forms gave way to much more slender images, with garments with a linear quality. Several of the principal images at Longmen wore long, flaring robes, hiding the body of the Buddha, modifying the simple toga-like robe inherited from Gandhara. In the later Tang, a more dramatic interpretation of human form was achieved, as we see in the small image of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, which has a height of 18.5 centimeters and is made in gilt bronze. This small image was likely used as part of a household altar or possibly made for dedication by an individual to a shrine. The creation of images, both large and small, highlights the devotional intent of Buddhist art. The pious hope to gain merit in the next world by making an offering of images of the Buddha and of bodhisattvas. Images were also didactic, conveying aspects of doctrine and belief. For example, this bronze statuette has an inscription giving us its date of 1339 and informs us that it was an offering by a monk as part of his search for enlightenment. It is a seated figure of the Bodhisattva Guanyin, or Avalokiteshvara, and it is from the Yuan dynasty and shows lightly flowing drapery, which provide a sense of movement which was missing from earlier sculptures.